October 4th, 1858, a yacht built in Long Island was retrofitted to add a hidden deck for smuggling purposes. The ship was named the Wanderer. It was registered with and flew the flag of the New York Yacht Club as it sailed from Charleston, South Carolina, across the ocean and up the Congo River basin. In Africa, the ship took on at least 487 slaves, most of whom were teenage boys from a Portuguese slaving post. After 6 weeks at sea, the Wanderer arrived at Jekyll Island, Georgia. Only 409 of the Africans had survived the ocean passage. The transatlantic slave trade had been banned in 1807, and it was clear to anyone who saw the passengers that they were not born in America but had been kidnapped and brought from Africa. To evade detection, one of the organizers of the trip, a man by the name of Charles Augustus Lafayette Lamar, had the African survivors sent to slave markets across Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. Even in spite of this, federal authorities still discovered what happened, and Lamar and several of his conspirators were arrested and charged for various crimes, including piracy. The case went to trial 3 separate times, but the federal government was unable to get a conviction, likely because the jury was composed entirely of white Southern men. One of the investors in the Wanderer, who federal investigators believed also helped illegally sell at least 37 of the kidnapped Africans, was a man by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest was primarily a slave trader. He was described by a contemporary as, quote, a sin-hardened Negro trader. His Memphis-based slave market was so profitable he opened the second slave market in Bedford, Mississippi. And to give you an idea of the type of business he ran and the kind of person he was, in 1859 he ran an advertisement stating, Fred Douglass's daughter for sale, in the local paper in Memphis. The ad further described the woman as being sold by saying, quote, she is said to be of the class known among dealers as likely girl, that is a native of North Carolina. The term likely girl was often used by slave traders to indicate a woman being sold into sexual slavery. The ad went on to state, Fred is ample able to make the outlay he should either purchase his own flesh and blood from servitude or cease his shrieks over an institution which possesses such untold horrors. The woman was not Frederick Douglass's actual daughter, although she may have been Anna Marie Bailey, a niece of Frederick Douglass. That history is unclear. But the intent of the ad, of course, was not. The advertisement was an offer from Forrest to Southern slave owners of the fantasy of raping Frederick Douglass's daughter. When the Civil War broke out, Forrest joined immediately despite being able to purchase exemptions with his wealth. Because he was willing to purchase equipment and horses with his own funds, he was made a lieutenant colonel and authorized to commission his own battalion of mounted rangers, despite Hibbs lacking any formal military training or experience. As part of his recruiting efforts, Forrest posted an advertisement in the local paper indicating, let's have some fun and kill some Yankees. By 1864, he had risen to the rank of Major General in the Confederate Army. On April 12th, he was part of an attack on the Union stronghold of Fort Pillow in Tennessee. After a long day of battle, Forrest had largely taken control of the fort. His forces controlled the high ground. The Union commander had retreated down to the bluffs near the Mississippi River, hoping his men would be able to be rescued from there. But when rescue ships didn't arrive, the remaining Union forces, which consisted of a nearly equal number of black and white soldiers, knew they had no choice but to surrender to the 1,500 Confederate troops that had surrounded them and taken most of the fort. What followed came to be known as the Fort Pillow Massacre. One of Forrest's own soldiers wrote, quote, the slaughter was awful. Words cannot describe the scene. The poor deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall to their knees with their uplifted hands, scream for mercy, but they were ordered to their feet and then shot down. The white men fared little better. The fort turned out to be a great slaughter pen. Blood, human blood, stood out in pools, and brains could have been gathered up in any quantity. I, with several others, tried to stop the butchery, and at one time had partially succeeded, but General Forrest ordered them to shot down like dogs, and the carnage continued. Finally, our men became sick of the blood, and the firing ceased. Forrest himself wrote, the river was dyed with the blood of the slaughter for 200 yards. There was in the fort a large number of citizens who had fled there to escape the conscript law. Most of these ran into the river and were drowned. The approximate loss was upward of 500 killed, but few of the officers escaping. It is hoped that these facts will demonstrate to the Northern people that the Negro soldier cannot cope with the Southerners. Forrest eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant general in March of 1865, but this promotion came just a month before Lee's surrender at Appomattox. But although the war had ended, the white supremacist fight had only just begun. Later that same year, in 1865, 6 former Confederate soldiers started a social club, calling themselves the Ku Klux Klan. They were inspired at least in part by another group called the Sons of Malta, which itself was somewhat of a parody of the Freemasons. Over time, more people invited and joined, and the group grew. Sometime between late 1866 and early 1867, Forrest himself was invited to join the group. The group was seeking leadership. As one of the 6 original founders of the group stated, "After the order grew to large numbers, we found it necessary to have someone of large experience to command. We chose General Forrest." Forrest had earned the nickname Wizard in the Saddle during cavalry days, and so he was given the title Grand Wizard and began actively recruiting members and expanding membership across the South, particularly among former Confederate soldiers. According to Forrest himself, the Klan had by 1868 40,000 members in Tennessee and over 500,000 members across the South. He described it as, quote, a protective political military organization. While the Klan was ostensibly operating as secret society, they were not in hiding. Forrest was a delegate for the presidential election of 1868, nominating his friend Francis Preston Blair Jr. for vice president under the slogan, quote, "Our ticket, our motto, this is a white man's country, let white men rule." During elections throughout the South in 1867 and 1868, Forrest and his fellow Klansmen not only threatened and physically attacked potential black voters, but often engaged in assassinations of local black leaders and white sympathizers. One of the highest-profile assassinations occurred in March of 1868, when U.S. Senate candidate and judge George Ashburn was assassinated by the Ku Klux Klan in Columbus, Georgia, following a speech given to a large mixed-race group. Despite all of the violence and voter suppression, at a national level, former Union General Ulysses S. Grant was still able to win the presidential election, and his party was able to control both houses of Congress, allowing them to pass additional laws targeting the Klan and other similar groups. But suppressing the vote in the South had helped the Klan win a number of state houses as well as local elections. In places like Alabama, Klan-backed authorities began charging many freed blacks with things like breach of labor contracts in order to more or less force them back into servitude. If they tried to resist, they then used the power of the state to put out warrants for their arrest. In one area along the Alabama-Mississippi border, a number of freedmen moved to nearby Meridian, Mississippi, where pro-union leaders had been able to maintain power. While the Mississippi officials would not execute the warrants from Alabama authorities would hire bounty hunters and deputize Klansmen to cross the border and bring the freedmen back, as the local government of Mississippi either lacked the power or motivation to stop them. Daniel Price was a white school teacher in an all-black school in Livingston, Alabama, who had moved to Meridian after himself facing threats for educating freedmen and for advocating for equal rights. One of the deputized sheriffs from Alabama acting as a bounty hunter was himself a former slave by the name of Adam Kennard. After Kennard had taken several freedmen back to Alabama, the freedmen and Price decided to retaliate. Late at night, Price and a small number of freedmen, all wearing disguises, snuck into the home where Kennard was staying and kidnapped him. They took him outside the city limits and proceeded to beat him, possibly as a warning to other bounty hunters, possibly with intent to kill. Kennard was able to escape and went to the authorities the next day, having recognized Price despite his disguise. As a result, Price became the first person charged under federal laws that were intended to protect blacks from groups like the Klan. On the first day of Price's trial, 50 armed white men from Alabama came to town, leading the hearing to be postponed for a week out of fear of violence. During that week, those 50 armed men began arresting several freedmen who were friends of Price on Alabama warrants, claiming they had committed crimes such as violating labor contracts or stealing money. These arrests angered and terrified the black community, many of whom had left Alabama specifically because of these types of arrests. Before the trial could occur, fearing violence for either outcome, local officials made a deal with prosecutors that if Price left town, the charges would be dropped. Price left, but the freedmen were still furious that the arrests they viewed as kidnappings were continuing without any actions from Mississippi authorities. At the same time, the white community in Meridian was largely unsympathetic to the problems of the freedmen and resented the local authorities, most of whom had been appointed by the state government and not elected locally. Federal troops were requested by the mayor to come ease tensions after Price left, and they did come for a brief time, but when no violence occurred, they left. On March 4, 1871, the mayor called a community meeting at the courthouse to plead his case to remain in power, and while around 200 people came, few of those who came were white. Most of the white community, on hearing of the courthouse meeting, decided the mayor needed to be removed and began organizing a mob to force the mayor to leave that evening. About an hour after the meeting adjourned, a fire broke out at the mayor's brother's store. The fire burned down most of the business district, which only had been recently rebuilt after being destroyed during the Civil War. The mayor was blamed, and while the fire was burning, one of the mayor's close advisors was attacked and struck in the head with the barrel of a shotgun. The very next day, on March 5th, charges were filed against the mayor and 3 other black leaders, J. Aaron Moore, William Clopton, and Warren Tyler, alleging they had started the fire. Just 2 days after the fire, they were brought to stand trial. Over 200 people, both black and white, crowded into the courtroom. The court was largely segregated with whites in the front and blacks in the back when the hearing began. What happens next somewhat depends on which witnesses' accounts you believe. The 4 men were searched for weapons when they were arrested. One of the men, Warren Tyler, then went to get a haircut prior to court, and the barber claimed he saw a pistol on him at that time. Others claim he was unarmed, and still others say he obtained a pistol after going into a side room in the courthouse with the mayor shortly before the trial. What isn't disputed is that when Tyler told the second witness, a man by the name of James Brantley, that, I quote, "I want to introduce 2 or 3 witnesses to impeach your veracity," that Brantley grabbed one of the court-martial's weapons, either a cane or a billy club, and charged at Tyler. At that point, a shootout ensued. The presiding judge was killed, and one of the other black co-defendants, William Clockton, was shot and badly wounded. Tyler was forced to flee to the second-floor balcony of the courthouse, where he jumped to the ground and attempted to escape through the barber shop. He was then found hiding in a ditch nearby by a white mob and shot to death. J. Aaron Moore had fallen near the judge when the shooting broke out and pretended to be dead while the courthouse was cleared. He then snuck out and ran into the woods toward the railroad tracks and was able to escape to Jackson, Mississippi, as the mob was unable to locate him. He never returned and was never rearrested, but the mob burned down his house and his church, which had also served as a school for the black community. The other injured black defendant, William Clockton, was put under armed guard, but the 2 guards reportedly said they, quote, could not waste their time on a wounded Negro murderer, and proceeded to throw his body from a second-story window of the courthouse. Clockton apparently survived the fall and was brought back into the courthouse alive at some point that evening, but by the time morning came, his throat had been slit along with 3 other black men arrested that night who had been brought to the courthouse. Several other black men were shot and killed in and around the courthouse, and over the next 3 days that followed, nearly every black leader in town and the surrounding area was murdered by white mobs. The killings only stopped when federal troops arrived. All told, at least 30 black men were murdered. 6 white men were charged with unlawful assembly and assault with intent to kill, but none were ever convicted or even brought to trial, as all potential witnesses feared for their safety they testified. The only conviction related to the event was that of a single Alabama Klansman who was convicted of raping a black woman during the riots. When the shooting started, the mayor escaped the courthouse and hid in an attic of a nearby boarding house until he was able to reach an agreement with the mob, where he resigned and left the city. Once he reached the north, he wrote of the event, quote, "They were all armed with double-barreled shotguns, and, as I was told, 200 in number. Many good citizens of Meridian pled for me, as well as many in the Ku Klux columns, who were in them not from choice but from necessity. They appointed committee after committee to wait upon me and to inform me I must leave by 10 o'clock the next day. Their principal commanders visited me. I wanted to know the whys and wherefores, but they say they came not to argue any question of right, the verdict had been rendered. They treated me respectfully, but they said their ultimatum was that I must take a northern-bound train. I yielded. At about 12 o'clock that night, perhaps 300 came and escorted me to the cars. Some difficulties and dangers presented themselves, but I got here in safety." Additionally, he wrote, "I am much a sufferer in pain and feeling, but I believe that the state of Mississippi is able to indemnify me. Let me urge the necessity of having martial law proclaimed through every southern state. The soldiery is to be sent there should be quartered on the rebels. Leniency will not do. Gratitude they have none. Reciprocation of favors they never dream of." In June of 1871, congressional hearings were held to investigate Klan violence, and they found that the Klan, quote, sought to carry out its purpose by murders, whippings, intimidations, and violence against its opponents. Despite his former title as Grand Wizard, Nathan Bedford Forrest now testified that he had no involvement in the Ku Klux Klan and that he was not a member. The committee wrote of this, "Our design is not to connect General Forrest with this order. The reader may form his own conclusion upon this question." The committee did find, quote, "The natural tendency of all such organizations is to violence and crime. Hence it was that General Forrest and other men of influence in the state, by the exercise of their moral power, induced them to disband." In fairness, by several accounts by this point, Forrest had actually separated from the views of the Klan, and he had called for the group in public and private to disband. He was even later condemned by white supremacist newspapers when later in life he gave what was described as a friendly speech to an organization of black Southerners dedicated to improve conditions for freedmen. But Pandora's box was already opened by this point. While the various secret societies and militia groups may have changed names in some of their leadership, they did not cease to exist, and in fact they continued to escalate their actions. The Anti-Klan laws were passed following the hearings in 1871, and these laws, in combination with the 1866 and 1870 laws, did lead to the newly created Federal Justice Department producing over 5,000 indictments and over 1,000 convictions of Klan members across the South. But it wasn't nearly enough. In Louisiana, as part of Reconstruction, several new parishes were created, one of them being Grant Parish. Grant Parish was named after Ulysses S. Grant, and its capital, Colfax, was named after Grant's vice president, Schuyler Colfax. The parish itself was established on Grant's inauguration day of March 4th, 1869. As you might expect by the naming, the parish was drawn to be majority black, although the margins were relatively narrow. The Louisiana election of 1872 was full of violence and controversy, with both sides claiming victory in both the governor's race and in many local elections. The departing governor was a man by the name of Henry Clay Warmoth. Warmoth had been elected as a pro-Union governor in 1868, largely based on the vote of free blacks, but due to a number of conflicts with his party during his term, he was not on the ballot and eventually would face impeachment. As a result of these conflicts, he gave support to the side of the white supremacists, and in January, during his lame duck, he appointed Christopher Columbus Nash as sheriff of Grant Parish. William P. Kellogg was the Union-supported governor who won the contested election on the eyes of the federal courts. Kellogg appointed a man by the name of Daniel Wesley Shaw to be sheriff and replace Nash, but Nash and other local officials refused to recognize his replacement. Nash was a Confederate veteran, an officer who had spent almost a year and a half in custody as a prisoner of war. Nash and others who Warmoth had appointed began recruiting armed white men from surrounding parishes, many of whom were Confederate war veterans. In late March of 1873, a black militia formed to defend the local courthouse after the leaders of the local white militia groups threatened to take the courthouse by force. Office holders appointed by Kellogg began sleeping at the courthouse, knowing they were unsafe in their homes at night from the threat of violence from white militia groups such as the Knights of the White Camellia. Soon many black women and children joined them. Kellogg also appointed a black Civil War veteran and state representative from the parish by the name of William Ward to command the local state militia in Grant Parish. Ward knew they were outnumbered and violence was likely. He gave a letter to a sympathetic white planter who owned much of the land around Colfax named William Smith Calhoun to take to Governor Kellogg to get reinforcements. Calhoun took a steamboat toward New Orleans to deliver his message, but the steamboat was hijacked by men from the white militia group. They forced Calhoun to return to Colfax to deliver the message that all blacks must leave the courthouse. On April 11th, Ward himself left the courthouse to try to get to New Orleans to get help, but it was too late. On April 13th, Easter Sunday, Nash led a group of around 300 white men, most on horseback, to the courthouse, bringing with them a cannon. Around noon, Nash commanded the defenders to leave. They did not. He then told the women and children camped around the courthouse they had 30 minutes to clear the area, which they did. Then the shooting began. Initially, there were few casualties on both sides, as both sides had defensible positions. But when the white militia began positioning the cannon to fire on the courthouse, some of the men inside panicked and attempted to make a run for the river. They were run down by white militiamen on horseback and killed. Some captured. Surrounded and fearing the courthouse would be set on fire, the black defenders waved the white flag of surrender. What happened next is disputed. The account of the militiamen was that a shot rang out from the courthouse as the militia approached to accept surrender. Others reported the shot came from behind. Either way, one of the leaders of the militia was fatally wounded, and all hope of any kind of peaceful surrender was lost. A massacre ensued, and the now unarmed black freedmen were set upon by the militia. Even the 50 men who were able to be taken prisoner were killed later that evening by the militia during drunken celebrations. There was only one known survivor, a black freedman by the name of Levi Nelson, who managed to crawl away unnoticed after being shot. All told, estimates are between 150 and 280 black freedmen were killed during the massacre. On the other side, most accounts agree only 3 white militiamen were killed. To put into context how many people died, during the election it was estimated only 760 black freedmen in total had voted in the entire parish. In the weeks that followed, federal authorities attempted to round up the white militia members who participated in the massacre. 97 of the men were indicted, but none were charged by state authorities. As it was made clear by the massacre itself, local authority was not up to the task of enforcing law against the white militias. If any justice would come, it would only come from federal intervention. U.S. Attorney James Roswell Beckworth was only able to bring 9 of the men to trial for violations of the federal law under the Ku Klux Klan Acts of 1870s, in part because any witness would risk death if they came forward to testify. During the first trial in 1874, 1 man was acquitted and a mistrial was declared regarding the other 8. A second trial was held, and in that trial 3 of the men were convicted on 16 separate charges, but federal judge Joseph Bradley dismissed the convictions, arguing the government had failed to prove any racial motivation, and released the 3 men on bail. All 3 men promptly disappeared. The federal prosecutors appealed to make sure this precedent didn't stand. In 1875, the case was taken before the Supreme Court in the United States versus Cruikshank. William Cruikshank had been the man who shot Levi Nelson, the only survivor of the massacre and one of the only witnesses willing to testify. Among the charges against Cruikshank was that he and the white militia had infringed on the rights of the freedmen, specifically their right to lawfully assemble, vote, and to bear arms. The hope was that the court, the majority of which had been appointed by Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, would affirm the Anti-Klan laws and provide the federal government the authority to protect the rights of freedmen in states that refused. But that hope was misplaced. On March 27, 1876, the Supreme Court not only agreed to uphold the reversal of the convictions in the matter, but they went further to essentially rule that the federal government had no power to protect the freedmen from white supremacist groups. The court wrote, "The government of the United States, although it is, within the scope of its power, supreme and beyond the states, can neither grant nor secure its citizens rights or privileges which are not expressly or by implication placed under its jurisdictions. All that cannot be so granted or secured are left to the exclusive protection of the states." With regards to the right to lawful assembly in the First Amendment, they wrote, "The First Amendment to the Constitution, prohibiting Congress from abridging the right to assemble and petition, was not intended to limit the actions of the state governments in respect to their own citizens, but to operate upon the national government alone. As to the Second Amendment, the Supreme Court ruled, quote, "The right to bear arms is not granted by the Constitution, neither is it in any manner dependent upon that instrument for its existence. The Second Amendment means no more than it shall not be infringed by Congress, and has no other effect than to restrict the powers of the national government." They went on to write, quote, "The people, for their protection and the enjoyment of it, must therefore look to the states, where the power for that purpose was originally placed." They ruled that the federal government could not prosecute non-state actors such as the Ku Klux Klan because, quote, "The 14th Amendment prohibits a state from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, but this adds nothing to the rights of one citizen as against another." Less than 10 years after the end of the Civil War, this ruling effectively ended Reconstruction. The federal government could not prosecute criminal acts against blacks, and the state's right to ignore even murder was absolute. As if all of this wasn't bad enough, the 5 justices who wrote and passed the ruling were the ones that were appointed by Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. There was now no realistic hope of it being overturned, only fear of things getting worse in the future. Throughout the South, white supremacist militias now knew they could terrorize black communities without any real consequences as long as they continued to win state and local elections. Without any fear of federal prosecution and having the full power of state government to ignore even murder, white supremacists were able to pass the various Jim Crow laws that stopped blacks from not just voting or holding political office, but even from sitting on a jury. In the 10 years following the Civil War, before the United States versus Cruikshank, 7 of the 13 former Confederate states had each elected 16 separate black members of Congress. These included 3 senators, 2 from Mississippi and 1 from Louisiana. When the Cruikshank decision was handed down, there were 8 black congresspeople at that time, out of a total of 369, or about 2.2% of Congress. The next House cycle, there were 4. The following cycle, only 1. From 1901 to 1929, there were no black members of Congress. From 1929 to 1945, there was a single seat in Illinois' 1st District that was occupied by 3 consecutive black members: Oscar Stanton DePriest, Arthur W. Mitchell, and William L. Dawson. It wasn't until 1869 that Congress had a number of black representatives that was greater than prior to Cruikshank in 1875, when a total of 11 were seated in the 1969 Congress. But even then, because Congress had expanded from 369 to 535 seats, those 11 representatives were still lower as a percentage at 2.1% than were the 8 in 1875 at 2.2%. To put this another way, it took over 90 years for the United States Congress to get back to the same level of representation that existed 10 years after the Civil War ended. Only one of those 11 members was from a former Confederate state. Bill Clay had become the first black member of Congress elected from Missouri in 1969. In 1973, Georgia elected Andrew Young to the House of Representatives after having no black representation for 102 years since Jefferson F. Long retired in 1871. Texas's first black representative ever was also the first Southern black woman ever elected to Congress, Barbara Jordan, in 1973. Tennessee's first black congressperson was Harold Ford Jr. in 1975. When Mississippi elected Mike Espy in 1987, 104 years had passed since John R. Lynch lost in 1882. William J. Jefferson was elected in Louisiana in 1991, 114 years after Charles E. Nash lost in 1877. North Carolina elected Eva Clayton in 1992, 91 years after George Henry White retired in 1901. South Carolina elected Jim Clyburn in 1993, 96 years after George W. Murray lost re-election in 1897. Virginia's election of Bobby Scott in 1993 came 103 years after John Mercer Langston lost re-election in 1891. Alabama's election of Arthur Davis in 1993 was 116 years after Jeremiah Harrelson lost re-election in 1877. And Florida elected Kendrick Meek in 1993, 117 years after Josiah T. Walls was removed after a contested election in 1876. And of course, there are still two Confederate states that have never elected a black congressperson: Arkansas and Kentucky. History is awkward.